The whole town laughed at his Hay-Bale fortress, and now they know why. A weathered veteran in a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket built a strange straw-bale home on the windy edge of North Platte, Nebraska, hoping to survive one more winter in peace. But when the blizzard hit without warning, roofs cracked, walls gave way, and families ran out of firewood in a single night. That's when his loyal German shepherd began barking at the whiteout, because footsteps were coming through the drifted snow, straight to his door. One by one, the same neighbors who mocked him arrived shaking, carrying children with numb fingers begging for warmth. And inside that foolish fortress, they discovered a secret that wasn't magic at all, just the kind of hard-earned wisdom only a veteran and a vigilant dog carries. What happened over the next 3 days would humble an entire town and change his life forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Winter pressed down on North Platte, Nebraska, with knife-sharp wind sweeping unhindered across the open plains. The cold arrived not as a sudden enemy, but as a patient force settling into bones, wood, and memory, reminding everyone that this land never belonged to those who underestimated it. Frank Miller felt that cold deeper than most. At 63, his body carried the quiet ledger of a lifetime spent enduring, rather than conquering, old knee pain from forced marches, a stiff shoulder that never fully healed after a roadside explosion overseas, and a gaze permanently trained to notice danger before it announced itself. Frank was tall but slightly stooped now, his frame lean rather than strong, with sharp cheekbones, a weather-creased face, and a gray beard he trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity. His eyes were pale blue, steady and withdrawn, the kind that had learned long ago that words were rarely as reliable as preparation. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket every day, faded at the elbows, clean but undeniably worn, pulled tight against the wind, as if it were armor. Beside him stood Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd, with a powerful chest, gray-black coat, and intelligent amber eyes that rarely blinked. Rex moved with quiet confidence, ears constantly shifting posture, alert yet calm like a soldier who had survived enough battles to know when noise was unnecessary. While the rest of the town rushed to seal their homes with plywood plastic sheeting and hastily nailed boards, Frank was doing something that made people stop their trucks in the road just to stare. On the edge of town, where the prairie stretched flat and endless, he stacked massive rectangular bales of compressed hay, as if they were bricks meant for a fortress rather than feed for cattle. Each bale was heavy and dense, the kind that required planning and leverage to move, and Frank handled them with deliberate care, laying them in thick courses that rose slowly but steadily. Mud from the local soil, dark, sticky, and cold, covered his gloves and boots as he packed it against the straw, sealing gaps, with patience rather than speed. To Frank, the work felt familiar. It reminded him of nights overseas, reinforcing barriers with whatever materials were available, trusting physics and instinct over appearances. But to the people of North Platte, it looked like madness. Laughter followed him daily. It wasn't cruel at first, more puzzled than hostile. Jim Harper, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and permanently reddened cheeks from years of outdoor labor, shook his head openly whenever he passed by. Jim had built his house the way his father had taught him wood. Frame-thin walls, quick completion, and he wore his practicality like a badge of honor. "That thing's gonna blow apart," Jim told anyone who would listen, not with malice but with certainty. Others were less kind. A woman from down the road muttered that Frank was embarrassing the neighborhood. Teenagers laughed and dared each other to throw small stones at the walls to see if they would sink in. Frank heard all of it. He simply did not respond. Experience had taught him that arguments wasted energy better spent preparing. At night, when the wind screamed louder and the cold seemed to crawl beneath his skin, Monk sat on an overturned crate inside the unfinished structure, Rex lying at his feet, and allowed himself the thoughts he never shared. He did not build the way he did because he wanted to prove anyone wrong. He built because he remembered what failure felt like. He remembered poorly insulated shelters, the way cold crept through small mistakes, the way arrogance killed faster than ignorance. There had been a night long ago when he had trusted the standard solution, trusted that tradition meant safety, and paid for it with the lives of men whose names still woke him in the early hours before dawn. That night had changed him. Since then, Frank believed only in what held up under pressure. The hay bales made sense to him. Straw trapped air. Air resisted cold. Thick walls absorbed sound and force. The mud sealed everything tight. It wasn't pretty, but survival rarely was. As he worked, Rex followed each movement closely, occasionally stepping forward to press his body against Frank's leg when the wind gusted too hard, grounding him in the present. Rex had been a rescue years ago, half-starved and skittish when Frank found him, but time and quiet companionship had shaped him into something steady and loyal. Frank trusted Rex's instincts without question. When Rex relaxed, Frank knew things were under control. When Rex stiffened, Frank paid attention. By late afternoon, the sky darkened, early clouds dragging low like heavy blankets. The town bustled with anxious energy as people rushed indoors, convinced they were ready. Frank finished another row of bales, wiped his hands on his jeans, and studied the wall in silence. He could already imagine the storm testing it, the wind throwing itself against the structure again and again, searching for weakness. Frank felt no fear, only a sober readiness. He had learned long ago that confidence wasn't loud. It was quiet, built one deliberate decision at a time. Rex sat beside him, tail-still eyes scanning the horizon, as if the approaching winter were something visible and tangible. As evening settled, a few neighbors slowed as they passed, their laughter quieter, now replaced by uncertainty. They still didn't believe in the structure, but the thickness of the walls, the absence of gaps, the way the building seemed to sink into the land rather than fight it, it unsettled them. Frank noticed the change but said nothing. He gathered his tools, patted Rex's head, and stepped inside the half-finished home where the wind already sounded different, muffled, distant, less threatening. In that moment, standing within walls everyone else mocked. Frank felt something rare, a calm rooted not in hope but in preparation. Outside, winter gathered itself, patient and merciless, unaware that one man and his dog had already stopped laughing long ago. The wind sharpened overnight, scraping across the plains, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Frank Miller rose before dawn, breath already fogging the air inside the unfinished structure, and stood still for a moment, listening not to the weather, but to what it was promising. This chapter of his life was never about building a house. It was about remembering how to stay alive when the world turned hostile. Frank did not build from habit or tradition. He built from memory, and memory had teeth. Years earlier, long before North Platte became his quiet exile, Frank had learned the language of cold in places far from Nebraska. In the northern deployment that ended his military career, winter was not a season, but an adversary. He remembered metal freezing skin on contact, the way thin walls amplified wind until it screamed like something alive, the way poorly sealed shelters stole heat faster than men could replace it. Those months had changed the geometry of his thinking. Thickness mattered. Stillness mattered. Silence inside a storm was never accidental, it was engineered. That understanding followed him home like a shadow, shaping every decision he now made with deliberate calm. Frank's hands moved steadily as he worked, even when his joints protested. He measured, adjusted, pressed, and sealed. The straw bales were no longer just materials. They were solutions. Each compressed block contained thousands of hollow stems, tiny chambers of trapped air that resisted the cold far better than wood ever could. Frank knew this not from textbooks, but from experience. Air was insulation's quiet ally. He stacked the bales in staggered patterns, avoiding continuous seams, building walls thick enough to absorb not only cold, but force. The mud plaster he packed between layers came from the land itself, heavy with clay mixed by hand, until it held together just right. It reminded him of reinforcing barriers overseas, with whatever soil was available, adapting instead of insisting. Rex followed every step, paws crunching softly against frozen dirt, nose testing the air, as if the coming storm were something he could smell. At 7 years old, Rex carried himself with controlled strength, his back straight muscles defined beneath thick fur. His ears tilted constantly, adjusting to distant sounds, while his amber eyes never strayed far from Frank. There was an understanding between them that required no words. Rex had once lived on uncertainty, too abandoned and wary until routine and trust reshaped him. Now, when the wind shifted suddenly, Rex let out a single low bark, not alarm, but acknowledgement, before settling again. Frank trusted that signal as much as he trusted his own instincts. By mid-morning, the town stirred. Trucks rolled past engines, loud doors slamming, neighbors bundled in heavy coats as they made final preparations. Among them was Sarah Collins, a woman in her late 30s who taught at the local elementary school. She was tall and slender, with ash-blonde hair usually pulled into a practical bun, and pale skin that reddened easily in the cold. Sarah carried herself with careful composure, but worry lived permanently behind her gray eyes. She had arrived in North Platte 2 years earlier, after a difficult divorce drawn by the promise of quiet stability. Her frame house, hastily built and thin-walled, creaked audibly, even on calm days. She slowed as she passed Frank's place, curiosity overcoming embarrassment. Sarah watched him work for a long moment, noting the thickness of the walls, the absence of gaps, the way the structure seemed grounded rather than exposed. She wanted to ask questions, but hesitated, aware of the laughter she herself had once shared at the sight of hay bales stacked like bricks. Frank noticed her presence without turning. He sensed uncertainty the way he sensed weather changes, subtle but meaningful. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice tight from cold. She asked whether he truly believed the house would hold. Frank turned, then his expression neutral, his blue eyes assessing not her doubt, but her fear. He answered simply that belief had nothing to do with it. Design did. Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing the words, and walked on without another comment, her thoughts heavier than before. As the day wore on, the laughter around town grew louder, more confident. Most homes were finished now, fireplaces, roaring windows glowing warmly at dusk. Frank's progress looked slow by comparison. Children still mocked the structure, but adults joined in too, their humor edged with superiority. Jim Harper passed again, pausing long enough to call out that Frank would regret wasting good hay when the cattle needed it. Frank replied only with a brief nod. He understood Jim's mindset well. It was the same thinking that had once cost lives when commanders relied on tradition instead of conditions. When darkness fell early, the temperature dropped sharply. Frank stepped inside the structure, now enclosed enough that the wind's voice softened as soon as the doorframe passed. He lit a small fire in the centrally placed stove, watching how the warmth spread evenly, rather than vanishing into thin walls. Rex curled near the heat, eyes half-lidded, but ears alert. Frank felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, but confirmation. The building behaved as expected. Outside, the wind howled louder, frustrated. That night, Frank lay awake on his cot, staring at the rough ceiling above him, mind drifting through memories he usually kept locked away. He recalled one winter night during his service when a poorly insulated shelter collapsed under sustained wind, forcing his unit to evacuate in darkness. He remembered carrying a younger soldier whose fingers had already gone numb, remembered the sound of that man's breathing slowing despite their efforts. Preparation had failed them then because appearance had been valued over function. That failure had ended Frank's faith in shortcuts. Now, decades later, he built as if those lives depended on it, even if no one else understood why. By morning, the sky had taken on a metallic gray hue, heavy and unmoving. Snow clouds gathered on the horizon, thick and deliberate. Frank stood outside with Rex surveying the structure one more time. The walls were complete now, thick, and sealed their surface, rough but solid. He pressed his palm against them, feeling not cold, but resistance. The storm would come. He knew that. The land always collected its due. What mattered was whether one listened closely enough beforehand. As Frank stepped back inside, the laughter from town faded behind him, replaced by a quiet that felt earned rather than accidental. January arrived like a held breath finally released. By late afternoon, the sky over North Platte darkened into a low metallic gray that pressed down on the town, heavy with promise. The wind shifted, first subtle but wrong, cutting across the plains at an angle that made old fences groan and loose signs shudder. Frank Miller noticed it immediately. He stood just inside the doorway of his straw-bale house, Rex at his side, both of them still listening. The air carried a tension Frank recognized from long ago, a pressure that meant something large was moving fast and without apology. By nightfall, the blizzard struck. Winds tore across the open land at speeds that felt less like weather and more like an attack, shrieking past 90 kilometers an hour, dragging snow sideways through the darkness. The temperature plunged with frightening speed, sinking past minus 20 degrees Celsius, as if the cold itself were eager to claim ground. Across town, North Platte began to come apart. Thin wooden houses creaked and complained under the relentless force, their walls flexing with every gust. Snow forced its way through seams no one had bothered to seal properly, piling against doors and windows, slipping into living rooms and kitchens like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Families huddled together in layers of clothing, burning through firewood they had expected to last the season in a matter of hours. Panic followed quickly behind discomfort. In one neighborhood, a roof partially collapsed under the weight of drifting snow, sending a father scrambling outside in the dark to pull loose boards free before they crushed the interior. Somewhere else, a couple abandoned their house entirely, wrapping their children in blankets and stumbling into the storm in search of shelter, their faces already numb and pale. Sarah Collins felt the failure of her frame house almost immediately. The walls groaned so loudly they drowned out the sound of the wind itself, and cold poured in through the narrow spaces between planks. Invisible gaps that had never seemed important before. Sarah was tall and slim, her movements precise even under stress, but fear made her hands shake as she tried to stuff towels and spare clothing into the worst cracks. Her ash-blonde hair had come loose from its bun strands, clinging to her damp cheeks, her skin already flushed and raw from the cold. She crouched near her small stove, coaxing the fire higher, but the warmth vanished as fast as it came. When she set a pot of water beside the flames, it formed a thin skin of ice within minutes. That was when the reality settled in her house was losing the fight. Not far away, Jim Harper's confidence collapsed alongside his certainty. His log cabin, built with the same methods his father had trusted, rattled under the constant pressure. The wind found every flaw in the chinking between logs, pushing icy air through cracks that widened with each violent gust. Jim, broad-shouldered and usually unshakable, moved frantically from wall to wall, pressing blankets and boards, wherever he could, his thick mustache already stiff with frost. His wife sat rigid near the fireplace, holding their youngest child close, her face drawn tight with fear. Despite feeding the fire relentlessly, ice crept along the interior walls, a thin white sheen that reflected the firelight in mocking silence. While the town struggled and splintered, Frank's straw-bale house stood unmoved. Inside, the storm sounded distant, muffled, as if it were happening to someone else entirely. The thick walls absorbed the wind's violence, turning its roar into a low, steady murmur. Frank moved calmly, brewing coffee on the small stove, his motions unhurried. The warmth inside held steady, wrapping the space in a quiet that felt almost unreal compared to the chaos outside. Rex lay stretched near the hearth, his body relaxed, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even. At one point he lifted his head, ears pricked, then settled again, satisfied. To Frank, that was confirmation enough. As the night deepened, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Snow piled against buildings faster than it could be blown away, forming drifts that swallowed fences and buried vehicles. In one house on the edge of town, an elderly couple realized too late that their heating had failed entirely. Wrapped in coats, they sat together in silence, teeth chattering, waiting for morning they were no longer sure would come. Elsewhere, a young family burned pieces of furniture to keep a fire alive, the acrid smell of smoke filling the room as desperation replaced pride. The blizzard showed no mercy, and North Platte's confidence eroded hour by hour. Frank spent part of the night sitting upright on his cot, hands wrapped around a warm mug, listening. His mind drifted uninvited back to another night under another storm years ago, when a shelter had failed, and the wind had sounded just as hungry. He remembered the way fear spread faster than cold, the way men began making mistakes once panic took hold. Here in this small, sturdy space, Frank felt the difference preparation made. The house did not fight the storm, it endured it. The walls did not shudder or protest. They simply existed, doing exactly what they were meant to do. Sometime before dawn, a new sound cut through the muffled wind, a distant shout nearly lost in the gale. Rex rose instantly, body tense, ears forward, a low warning rumble vibrating in his chest. Frank stood, pulling on his boots and heavy flannel jacket, and moved toward the door. He paused there, listening again. The shout came once more, closer now, followed by the crunch of footsteps through deep snow. Frank exhaled slowly. He knew what this meant before he opened the door. The storm had already decided which shelters were strong enough and which were not. When Frank finally cracked the door open, a blast of icy air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of sobbing and the sharp scent of fear. Outside, shapes moved in the darkness, neighbors fighting their way through the storm, toward the only structure still standing, quiet and whole. Frank did not hesitate. He stepped aside, holding the door wide as Rex backed away to make space. The laughter that had followed him for weeks was gone now, replaced by something heavier and far more honest. Winter had spoken, and North Platte was listening. Dawn had not yet arrived when the knocking began, sharp and uneven, barely audible beneath the storm's roar, but unmistakable to anyone who had learned to listen for desperation. Frank Miller was already awake, sitting upright on his cot, boots on, flannel jacket buttoned to the throat. Years of service had trained him to recognize that particular rhythm, knuckles striking wood, not in confidence but in fear. Rex rose instantly, his large frame moving between Frank and the door, ears forward. Body tense, tail low but steady. He did not bark. He never barked unless there was true threat. This was something else. Frank opened the door without hesitation. The cold rushed in violently, dragging snow and darkness with it, but it was quickly eclipsed by the sight before him. Jim Harper stood on the threshold, his broad shoulders hunched inward, his face stripped of its usual color and bravado. His thick mustache was rimmed with ice, his beard uneven where frost had clung and broken away. In his arms he carried his youngest son, a thin boy of about 6, wrapped in too many blankets that had done too little. The child's face was pale lips tinged blue, his small body unnaturally still except for shallow breaths. Jim's eyes, once loud with certainty, were wide and raw, shining with something close to panic. He tried to speak, but failed, his mouth opening uselessly before sound finally broke through, cracked and hoarse. He did not ask for help. He did not need to. Frank stepped aside immediately, placing a firm hand on Jim's shoulder to guide him in. Rex moved back at once, positioning himself near the wall to clear space, eyes never leaving the child. The warmth inside the house wrapped around them like a living thing. Jim staggered forward, collapsing onto a bench near the stove, holding his son closer, as if afraid the heat itself might disappear. Frank knelt, checking the boy's hands and feet with practiced efficiency, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. He said little, only short, steady instructions. Jim obeyed without question, nodding sharply, tears freezing into the lines of his weathered face. The knocking came again before Frank could fully close the door. Then again, and again. Each time he opened it, another neighbor stood there, half buried in snow, eyes hollow fear, etched deeply into faces that had laughed only days earlier. Sarah Collins was among them, her coat pulled tight around her slender frame, her ash-blonde hair tangled and stiff with frost. Her pale skin looked almost translucent in the dim light, her lips trembling not from cold, alone but from the shock of realizing how close she had come to real danger. She clutched a small bag to her chest, hands red and swollen, eyes darting around the interior as if afraid to trust what she felt. When Frank met her gaze, she swallowed hard, shame flickering briefly before gratitude replaced it. She whispered a quiet thank you voice, barely audible, and stepped inside. More followed. An elderly couple whose names Frank barely knew, bent with age and exhaustion, leaning on each other for balance. A young mother with a toddler pressed against her chest, the child's face blotchy and exhausted from crying. 2 brothers from the edge of town, both shaking violently, boots soaked through their bravado, long since abandoned somewhere in the snow. Frank counted quickly without making it obvious, already calculating space heat supplies. He had done this before, under worse conditions. The principles were the same. Inside the straw-bale house, the transformation was immediate and undeniable. Children stopped shivering within minutes, their bodies responding to steady warmth rather than frantic bursts of heat. Adults sank onto benches and crates, shoulders sagging, as adrenaline drained away, replaced by exhaustion and quiet disbelief. The air smelled faintly of earth and straw and soon bread. Frank had set a small loaf to bake earlier, a habit carried over from colder times when morale mattered as much as calories. The scent spread slowly, grounding everyone in something painfully ordinary. Outside, the storm screamed and battered the walls. Inside, the thick straw absorbed the violence, leaving only a distant, muffled reminder of the chaos beyond. Rex moved among them, with calm authority, stopping near each child, lowering his large head to sniff gently, as if taking attendance. His amber eyes softened when he found no danger, and he settled near the hearth again, watchful but relaxed. One of the children reached out hesitantly, touching his fur. Rex remained still, allowing it a quiet sentinel who seemed to understand that this night required gentleness as much as vigilance. No one spoke of the laughter now. It hung in the room, unspoken, heavy, but strangely irrelevant. Jim Harper sat with his son wrapped in fresh blankets, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched tight. The man who had once mocked Frank openly now looked smaller somehow, not in body, but in certainty. Sarah sat nearby, hands wrapped around a warm cup, her posture rigid as if afraid that relaxing might invite disaster back in. She studied the walls, the thickness, the absence of drafts, the quiet. In her mind, lessons rearranged themselves painfully. What she had dismissed as foolishness had become her refuge. Frank moved among them, quietly distributing water, checking, breathing, adjusting the fire with measured care. He did not lecture. He did not explain. He knew better. In moments like this, survival erased arguments more effectively than any words ever could. His past had taught him that people learned fastest when consequences were undeniable. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a sober sense of responsibility. These people were here because his preparation had worked. That was enough. As the night wore on, the storm showed no sign of easing. Snow continued to pile against the outer walls, pressing inward, but the house held. The thick straw did not complain or crack. It simply endured, adding insulation, where snow drifted higher, sealing itself tighter against the cold. Frank noticed this with quiet approval. Nature, when understood, often became an ally rather than an enemy. Near dawn, with the worst of the panic settled, Frank finally allowed himself to sit. Rex shifted closer, resting his head briefly against Frank's knee. Frank placed a hand on the dog's broad skull, fingers pressing into familiar fur, grounding himself in the present. Around them, people slept in awkward positions, exhaustion finally claiming them. The laughter that had once followed Frank's work had not vanished, it had transformed. It had become silence, humility, and a kind of reluctant respect born not from persuasion, but from survival. Morning came slowly to North Platte, as if the land itself needed time to recover from what it had endured. The storm withdrew without ceremony, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Snowdrifts towered where roads had been fences, disappeared beneath sculpted white ridges, and the town emerged altered, humbled, stripped of its assumptions. Frank Miller stepped outside his straw-bale house with Rex at his side and took in the damage with the calm of a man who had seen aftermaths before. His home stood nearly unchanged, its thick walls pressed with snow that now acted like an extra blanket rather than a threat. Around it, other houses told a harsher story, warped doors frozen shut, collapsed porches, shattered windows, roofs sagging under weight. They were never designed to bear. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. The laughter that once carried across the prairie had been buried beneath ice and consequence. People emerged cautiously from the straw-bale house as daylight strengthened. They looked different now, exhausted, grateful, quieter. Jim Harper lingered near the doorway, his broad frame stiff with fatigue, his face deeply lined as if the night had aged him years. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice lacked the certainty that once defined him. He kept his son close, resting a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder, grounding himself in the proof of survival. Sarah Collins stepped outside next, squinting against the glare off the snow. Her ash-blonde hair had been hastily braided back, her pale skin marked with the faint shadows of sleeplessness. She took a long breath, steadying herself, and looked at Frank's house again, not with curiosity this time, but with a teacher's instinct to understand a lesson she had nearly ignored. Rex sat near Frank's leg posture, relaxed tail sweeping the snow in slow arcs, as if the crisis had passed and his watch could finally ease. As the day unfolded, the town assessed its losses. Some homes were deemed unsafe to re-enter. Others would require repairs few could afford. The old couple Frank barely knew stood staring at the remains of their living room wall, hands clasped together, faces resigned rather than angry. A young mother cried openly as neighbors helped retrieve what little could be saved from her house. The winter had not chosen favorites. It had simply tested structures and beliefs with equal indifference. By afternoon, people began drifting back toward Frank's place, not to seek warmth now, but answers. They came singly or in small groups, hats in hand, voices careful. How thick were the walls? How did the plaster keep the wind out? Did the straw rot? Did mice get in? Frank listened, nodding, answering without flourish. He explained that the straw was dry and tightly packed, that the plaster sealed air movement, that thickness mattered more than appearance, and that materials already present in the land often performed better than those imported to satisfy habit. He did not claim invention. He spoke of observation. Frank's demeanor never shifted toward pride. He stood with shoulders slightly hunched, hands scarred and steady, his gray beard catching light as he talked. When asked why he never argued back when people mocked him, he shrugged. Arguing had never kept anyone warm. Rex accepted the attention he received with quiet patience, allowing children to pet his fur, his amber eyes half-lidded, as if he understood that he too had become part of the story. The dog's presence eased people. They trusted Frank partly because Rex did. As weeks passed and the snow slowly retreated, changes took root. Jim Harper, once the loudest skeptic, was the first to return with serious intent. He arrived one morning with a notebook, face set in concentration, asking Frank to walk him through the process from foundation to finish. Jim listened closely, interrupting only to clarify measurements, his practical mind reorienting itself toward a new definition of practicality. Sarah Collins followed soon after, bringing questions of her own. She had always been observant, but now there was urgency behind it. Her frame house was salvageable, but she no longer trusted it. She spoke candidly about fear, about realizing how easily comfort had masked vulnerability. Frank respected that honesty. He answered her questions carefully, encouraging her to think in terms of function rather than fashion. By early spring, the sound of construction returned to North Platte, but it was different now. There was less rushing, more measuring. Fewer jokes, more discussion. Thick walls began to rise on lots where laughter once lived, straw bales stacked deliberately, plaster mixed patiently. Frank lent tools and time when asked, guiding without commanding. He watched Rex patrol the work sites with the seriousness of a foreman occasionally settling near a new wall as if approving its progress. Children no longer threw stones. They asked questions. The town did not rename Frank a hero, nor did he become a man of speeches. His legacy settled in quieter ways. Fuel consumption dropped. Homes stayed warmer. People slept better when the wind rose again. The memory of that winter lingered not as trauma, but as instruction. Frank remained where he was, tending his routines, wearing the same red and black flannel jacket, greeting neighbors with brief nods that now carried weight. He understood something many never did, that survival was not about outlasting nature, but aligning with it. Years later, newcomers would hear the story secondhand, the veteran, the dog, the Hay-Bale house that saved a neighborhood. Details would blur, but the core would remain. A man listened when others laughed. He built with humility and patience. When the storm came, he opened his door. The land remembered such choices. And in North Platte, long after that winter passed into memory, people built not just warmer houses, but wiser ones, guided by a lesson learned the hard way, that what is overlooked can become essential, and that respect for the earth is often repaid in survival. In the end, this story was never really about straw storms or even survival. It was about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or light, but with wisdom, patience, and a heart willing to listen. Some would call what saved that town good planning or common sense. Others might call it luck. But many would recognize something deeper at work, God's hand moving through humble materials, and a humble man reminding us that he often uses what the world overlooks to protect his people. In our everyday lives, we face storms, too: illness, loss, fear, uncertainty, moments when laughter turns into knocking and pride gives way to prayer. This story reminds us that preparation is faith in action, that listening to God's quiet guidance matters more than following the noise of the crowd. Sometimes the miracle isn't the storm stopping. Sometimes the miracle is being ready when it comes. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet lessons God may be placing in your own life. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if you believe in stories that honor faith, resilience, and the grace of God working through ordinary lives, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you and your family, keep you warm in every season, guide your steps, and grant you peace. We pray that His protection surrounds you today and always. Amen.